Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm speaking with Jenara Nerenberg. Jenara is an author, producer, speaker, and journalist. She has graduated from the Harvard School of Public Health at UC Berkeley with interdisciplinary degrees and emphasis on political theory, race relations, and media. She is the creator of the Neurodiversity Project and the Interracial Project, and she is the author of the acclaimed book, Divergent Mind, which is what we talk about in this episode. We start out by talking about some of the gray areas of neurodiversity. We talk about what is neurodiversity, what is a highly sensitive person, but we also talk about these functions of folks that kind of don't fit in a box, and why there is some diversity with folks that are different in many ways, in how they think or how they have intuitions, and why we need to really find not only acceptance but integration of folks that are seeing the world a little bit differently. And so we talk about the importance of that. We talk about her critiques of psychiatry and psychology, and specifically the diagnostic process. We talk about the curious evolution of diagnoses and what that's like. We talk about, again, some of these gray areas where people may have certain challenges, but not necessarily meet criteria for, let's say, a psychiatric diagnosis, and where do those gray areas fit? And so we also talk about some of the difference between diagnosis and treatment. And then we also talk about what are some practical ways within society and within the environment of how there can be some changes within society, but then also some changes with certain folks and how they can adapt, and then how also communities and certain organizations and certain places in the world can also adapt as well. So this is kind of, both areas can be moving forward. I have to say, I absolutely love this conversation for a variety of reasons. You will see, and you'll hear in many ways, we have some fundamental differences and some disagreements. One of the things that's wonderful about her is that she is very kind, she's very clear, and it will be clear when we have some disagreements, but we both are curious about each other's perspectives. I certainly was. I absolutely loved hearing her perspective. I think it's so valuable. It's super important. And I really felt the same from her as well. And, having that kind of, yes, some disagreements, but really learning from each other, I certainly did, and being able to work together to try and solve some of these problems and challenges in the world, and how we can make, the world a better place for everybody. That's, I think, important. And again, I value her work, her perspective, and really this conversation. It was very meaningful for me, and so I'm so pleased to bring you my conversation with Jenara Nerenberg. I'm here with Jenara Nerenberg. Jenara, thanks you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you about your book and your work, and so it's a real big privilege.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Your book is called Divergent Mind, Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You. This is a couple years old now, right? What is this, 2 years old? How old is this?
It came out March 2020.
Well, there you go. There you go. It's exactly 2 years old. It's in a paperback now. Did it go to hardcover first and then paperback?
Yeah. So it came out hardcover March 2020. Completely wrecked our whole book tour plan, which was rough. But then a year later, it came out in paperback. And so we had, time to plan ahead. So we had a fun virtual book launch with a bunch of other authors, and and it's on Kindle and audiobook and all that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, well, it's really nice. It's also very digestible. I think most people can, pick this up and get through it. It's just not like super dense or, anything like that. It's very relatable and, it's a good length, all that wonderful stuff. Tell people who you are and what it is that you do, and then some of your reasons and inspirations for writing the book.
Yeah. Well, I was a journalist for about a decade. I got my start reporting in Asia, actually, for Fast Company magazine and CNN. Before that, my studies were actually in political theory and race relations. I was at Berkeley. And then for grad school at Harvard, I did public health with a focus on media and disparities. And so my background is super interdisciplinary. That's kind of what led me to journalism. And yeah, the book came about because I was sort of going through some stuff and trying to figure out how my own mind seemed to work a little bit differently. So I got really interested in this area of neurodiversity. And yeah, kind of just launched me on a journey to look sort of personally and professionally at the same time. And that's where the book came from.
Yeah. So the book tackles neurodiversity, I think, is as a general construct in terms of there's many groups and many individuals that kind of fit under that umbrella term. Would you say that the book mostly sits within that kind of universe, or is it more broad, or this kind of neurodivergent movement? How do you see where I guess it lands?
Yeah, well, so I mean, going back, I grew up in the heart of San Francisco, and in the 90s, this is kind of pre-Silicon Valley. It was still just a really open-minded place to live. And so a lot of that ethos really formed who I was and who I am. And so diversity in all forms was a, big theme in my life. And I had thought about things like, viewpoint diversity, or what I was calling like temperament diversity and emotional diversity. And then I started thinking, sort of looking, actually, I was like, is there, is this a thing? Like, this is, after, this was after grad school. And I was like, is this out there? Is there a conversation happening? And I stumbled upon this word neurodiversity. And I was like, oh, okay, this seems to, capture what I'm thinking about, just acknowledging the kind of diversity of how our minds are made up and things like that. So I was drawn to the term for that wide umbrella, so, it's just acknowledging basic neurological diversity. And that would include a range of things, right? Anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia. It's just sort of destigmatizing, sort of having a more accepting outlook on the range of who people, the way people are, right? And so that's how I started getting into this topic and where the book is situated. I did focus more specifically within that on 5 different sort of traits. I've always been very interested in this trait of high sensitivity, and that was something that I had come across in college. There is this term, highly sensitive person. There's research that was carried out by Elaine Aron. And so then I got curious because I started seeing that heightened sensitivity was a common feature in a lot of other things too. So autism and ADHD, sensory processing disorder, and then even synesthesia. And I looked at mirror touch synesthesia, which is, the crossing of the senses, but it's when someone kind of physically or emotionally really feels what the other person is feeling. And it's been well documented by Joelle Salinas, who's a neurologist at Mass General. So my book within neurodiversity focuses on these different traits that have high sensitivity in common. That being said, in the mainstream sort of like media landscape, neurodiversity is often used as a synonym for autism, which it's not. That's very limiting. I mean, it's great that, this one form of neurodivergence has gotten a lot of attention, and it's fantastic. But I've been doing some work around trying to raise awareness that this term is really a philosophical shift, and it's an exciting one that should be applied more broadly.
So I'm trying to get your, I guess, motivations kind of pinpointed here. So your idea, I mean, there's a personal component here, but also just kind of in society, is there's different ways in which people are different. You could see this in terms of, many people would say, as racial diversity or gender diversity, or many, viewpoint diversity. When we say those terms, we're trying to say, like, there's different points of view. Yeah. There's different perspectives, right? So if I'm a certain gender, or if I'm a certain race, or if I have a certain idea, there's going to be differences there that are going to have some way of showing the world in a different way. And so with neurodiversity, at least how you started, and maybe how you still use it, is, what are these facets or components or tenets of folks that have different ways in which their neurological underpinnings within themselves are affording them to see the world differently than, what you would say neurotypical, I guess, folks are. Is that some version of how you're defining this?
Yeah, I think that captures and summarizes it pretty well.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned the highly sensitive person. So maybe just tell, some people may be aware of this, but to your knowledge, what is, how do you define that? What is that for you? Is there a type of continuum of what that looks like? How is it seen in other challenges? Just kind of expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so highly sensitive person. Again, this term was coined in the 90s by a researcher and psychologist, Dr. Elaine Aron, and it's sort of just general sensitivity. And she found in her research that 15 to 20% of the population is highly sensitive in some way, and it's a general sensitivity to like noise, light, not being being rushed, like sensitive to commotion, loud noises, and also like picking up on sort of, if someone is angry or something like that. So it's more of a general description of sensitivity, and she paints that as like a personality trait. And then since she kind of coined that term, because she was observing this a lot in her clients, that has now been replicated elsewhere. So UCSF, Thomas Boyce, he wrote a great book, actually, The Orchids and the Dandelions, and he found the same thing in his pediatric clinics, that it seemed like 20% of the kids were just very, very sensitive. And what that meant was that when they had very nurturing environments, they really soared, they really thrived. But for these same sensitive kids, if there was any kind of hardship or just, not a very accepting environment, they really wilted. So he calls them orchids. And then at UC Berkeley, I didn't follow his research too close, and I didn't even get into it in the book, but I sort of looked at it afterwards. Blanking on his name right now, but he found, again, that around, I think he said maybe even 20 to 30% of the population is more emotionally sensitive. So they just get like more affected by things in general. So, so that just, hopefully that paints a picture of just what it means to what I mean by sensitive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not close to this literature, so I can't speak confidently on it. Excuse me. I wonder, you had mentioned it again, as much as you want to share or not. You had mentioned that some of this work on the book was there's some personal components to it. I don't know if you care to share or want to divulge any of the personal features for yourself of why these topics were interesting for you.
Oh yeah, totally. So I was always a very sensitive kid, and I didn't have any diagnoses or labels or anything, but I was, sensitive in the way also of being very deeply curious about the world. I mentioned growing up in San Francisco, and I was very attuned, sort of, to the adults around me and the neighborhood, and just really took everything in. And this was a helpful feature. I did theater, and I did really well in college and grad school. But then as I got older, like further into my adulthood, it became a little harder because I was still quite affected by things. And so, as responsibilities increase in adulthood, and there's more layers of complexity, right? It became just harder for me to sort of navigate and switch between these different spaces. So one of the things I talk about in the book is this experience of hyperfocus, which is very common for whether you're a sensitive person, or if you have ADHD, or if you're autistic. And, I was married and a new parent. And this is a common story here of, especially adult women after they become parents. Everyone is exhausted, and it's rough and everything. But I found it difficult to utilize that same sort of trait of sensitivity, which served me very well as a journalist, for example, and like hyper-focusing my work and really excelling in school, to then switching over to really just kind of practical, daily, mundane stuff, which gets a bit more relentless, as you get older and you take on more. So it was that sort of juncture that made me more curious about, why was I having this kind of difficulty? It had been there since I was a kid, but it was more intensified now. So I never sought out any kind of formal diagnosis or anything like that, but based on what I had been reading, and I was starting to see articles pop up like left and right, it sounded like my experience matched something like ADHD or the autism spectrum. And so I got really curious about those two things. And it turned out that there was kind of this lost generation of women who were kind of flying under the radar because they had done so well. And so, so that was formative for me, starting to see some of this as, possibly autism spectrum or ADHD. I do have a lot of skepticism around diagnostic criteria and sort of the nature of diagnoses within psychiatry. So again, I didn't go down the formal diagnosis route, but I sort of used those lenses to dive into an exploration of the experience of heightened sensitivity, and particularly for adult women, which is what my book focuses on. I didn't look at kids because there's already so much out there, but really adult women, it's a missing demographic.
This is very interesting. Your kind of navigation and journey through some of these different challenges. It sounds like there was a pretty, I guess you could say, instructive life change or life event for you, becoming a mom, which can be super awesome, but also super challenging as well. Being a parent is tough. And it sounds like that was a kind of a big shift for you as a kind of a life event. I did want to, you brought it up, and I was going to ask you about this next. So for the first part of the book, I think, you critiqued the DSM and the history of psychiatry pretty hard. You have some pretty harsh criticisms about that. And it's fair to say you're probably not the biggest fan. And it is without question, right, that historically, the DSM and the American Psychiatric Association have not been favorable to women. They've always been political. They're still political. I guess my question here. So I'm not disputing that. I'm agreeing with you on that point for sure. What are your main, I guess, criticisms of the DSM and I guess the field of psychiatry and I guess loosely maybe clinical psych? And why did you feel the need to, I guess, address them in your book?
Yeah, I thought it was important for my readers, many of whom would, primarily be adult women. I wanted my readers to have a sense of, what happened historically to inform our notions of normality. And because I think there's so many women out there who walk around feeling a lot of shame and anxiety and depression and these things because their experience of the world doesn't match up to what they're being told is sort of the norm, right? And so I think it's important for people to understand how these various fields and these frames and these criteria come to be. And at the same time, I don't discount the amazing benefits that the fields have brought. And I'm very agnostic when it comes to that. I think people should just do whatever works best for them, whether it's medication or having a formal diagnosis or not, or, I think that's a very individual decision. But my primary motive is, to equip people with information, essentially. So, I mean, as with many other fields and historically, the psychology and psychiatry, first of all, of course, were developed by men early on, as with many other fields.
I think most fields have been developed by men.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think you'd have to find a field that was developed by women. I don't know if it might exist. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. So that's not a unique critique at all. But it's, again, I think most people don't really stop to think about sort of these things. So that's why I led with that in the book. And yeah, I mean, there were some pretty strange ideas early on. Again, that's very common, right? But, looking at, for example, women who wanted to work outside of the home, they were labeled with hysteria or, their reproductive organs were blamed. So even, that's pretty well known. There's, and, when the slaves were brought to the U.S. from Africa, and then they expressed, a desire to escape to their freedom, they were also labeled with mental illness. And there were real terms, it's drapetomania. They're real labels and terms that were created to apply to human beings. And so my goal was to sort of raise this question of, the power of words, the power of language, and the power of framing, and to kind of help people to question those things so that it can kind of like chisel away at what many of us think as we grow up, which is that, there's some well-defined notion of normal, and, any departure from that needs to somehow be worked on or something like that. So it's a bit of kind of destigmatizing work to do up front in the book before launching into, the interviews and further exploration.
So I hear what you're saying, and again, like I said, I don't disagree. I think that yes, the history of both APAs, American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, have a history that has not been favorable to all groups of people at different points in their creation. I guess I see it a little bit different. So certainly, I'll stick with psychology because that's what I know. I won't speak too much on psychiatry. It's not my field. With psychology, it's a relatively young field. So we've had medicine around since, the 3rd century, whatever it is, so officially or whatever. We've had psychiatry around for, because psychiatry is an offshoot from medicine, for a long time. So psychology is very young. Most places put the beginning of psychology with William James in the late 19th century. And then you have, Freud, who was momentous for his, ways of categorizing things in the early 20th century. And then, just kind of got the ball rolling. And here we are 120 years, 130 years later. And so I will grant you that many of the origins start, like many things, they're a product of their time. So, were women labeled hysterical for having things that we would probably commonly see as anxiety? Yeah. And that was that latent or manifest, if you will, probably with misogyny? Yeah, sure. I wouldn't dispute that. I don't think that was the case all the time. I think some of it was ignorance. I think it was a product of the times. I guess my biggest, issue here is two issues here on this point as a framing issue. Because an institution or various institutions and associations and outside of that fields of study have a rocky start to their formation does not mean that they continue to be that way currently. And in fact, you can look at this in terms of a framing issue for the fields, but then also in terms of diagnosis. With psychology in general, many times it's when fields are trying to start or originate, they're trying to do one or two things, right? They're not trying to tackle everything at one time. That's usually how, if you think of, the United States, how they started. Everyone picks on the founders for many of their issues about slavery or many of their ideas about women, and that's fair. But the major goal was, how do we become our own country, and how do we become our own country from this tyrannical country in England and King George III, et cetera. That was the first and primary goal. And I think psychology was the same. How do we operationalize? How do we have some system? We don't have a system. How do we just bare bones make a system for trying to understand the human psyche, for how we understand human behavior? There wasn't a system for that. And so people like William James and people like Freud, and then, people in behaviorist movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, so on and so forth, it became a kind of building. Okay, Freud got a lot wrong. There's things he didn't get wrong. Okay, we don't disqualify him because he got some things wrong in 1910. But as we do science, and as we have other people that come after him, and then, we have all these offshoots and things like that, we build on it, we make it better. And so I would say your points, I think, are fair, but I think a little bit incomplete, because since every decade, the 70s, the 80s, certainly the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and then the current decade we're in, each decade has more and more robust scientific data and literature on the field itself, the therapeutic outcomes and qualities of treatment, and then also within diagnostic criteria itself. I mean, there's, I could fill this room and, probably my entire basement of, the mountains of data we have on many of these phenomena that we understand and we see. And so, I mean, that's again, progressively better and better each decade. So, I mean, this is considering different cultures. This is considering men, women, different races, different ethnicities, different ages, different backgrounds, different environmental contexts, different genetic pieces, all of these things are, and then most importantly, especially with the early 90s until today, the absolute explosion of research and data we have on neurological underpinnings, neuroscience, neuropsychology. I mean, mountains of data on these things that we know are real and true and I would say factual. There's a few things that people, I think, kind of continue to kind of argue and debate about in terms of taxonomy. But there are many things that are fairly established now. And I'll just say as a smaller point here that aside from having empirical data built over 70 plus years now, many of the fields currently, I'm saying currently, in social work, professional counseling, psychology, and medicine are all majority women in those fields. It's over 55%, I think, now that are females that graduate from most medical schools. When I was in grad school, getting my doctorate in clinical psych, I think most of my classes, I was the only guy. It's 80-20, men to or women to men. I think overwhelmingly in social work, overwhelmingly in counseling. That only continues now as I, teach as well. It's always, most of my students are, 90-10 women to men. So I think you start out, you try and have some structure, try and build something, and then here we are, 70, 80, 90, 100, 120 years later, I think we have some good equality. I think we have some good parity. I think we have some good, robust ways in trying to understand the field. And then that plays out with how do we study things that affect certain groups of people or certain populations or et cetera. So I guess in that way, I know I've kind of rambled here, but what are your thoughts, I guess, in terms of the evolution of how all of these things have kind of transpired?
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I certainly know, a lot of therapists and psychologists who are very open-minded to different ideas, about what normality is. So I guess that's the other thing. I think you're right that, the field for sure now is dominated by women. I guess I'm of two minds about it, because I think in some ways, even though it's dominated by women, they're still sort of inheriting a field now that had its inception by men. And that's okay. the field will probably be remade in a sense, I guess. But I guess one thing we didn't really get into is beyond sort of like a gender bias issue, there's this issue of, what counts as normal, or what is the benchmark, who defines that. And so I think that's my other concern. And that question is not limited to, which gender it is, right? That's no longer about, is this field being run by men or women now? And actually I interviewed quite a few male therapists and neurologists who were very sensitive to a kind of a more neurodiversity inclined outlook. So yeah, I think those are great points. And I think it's just important to think about who's doing the defining, and there's still some issues there. I'm thinking of, a few women therapists or doctors that I know of that are, I would say, kind of stuck in a fixed notion of what it means to be kind of a normal, so-called normal or so-called productive functioning sort of entity. And that's something that neurodiversity sort of pushes back on. So yeah.
I mean, so those are two separate issues, which I'll come to the second one. So about the first one, I mean, yeah, I would say for the past 25, 30 years, look, we can't change the history of anything. And I think we have to know our history and be informed by our history. And certainly that's a product of the times and culture and society. But I mean, past 25, 30 years, I mean, it's been, very dominated by women, those fields. Both in the new students and trainees. And I'm almost positive in this, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the current president of the American Psychiatric Association and American Psychological Association are both women, and they're not the first women to hold those positions. So in terms of power, in terms of influence, in terms of direction, in terms of who gets to decide how things are just oriented, women are, and I mean, it's the highest position you can be in those associations. And I'll just say, in terms of normal, any well-trained psychologist does not use those terms. They do not use the terms normal. We don't really define things that way. There's different ways of categorizing things. I mean, I kind of know what you're saying, I think colloquially, but, and even in the sense of, like, if you're thinking about disorders, so much that, we don't even use the term abnormal psychology anymore. Most schools have done away with that. It's, psychopathology, or it's, there's different ways. I mean, again, terms are important to an extent. At the same time, we're talking about the same thing. We're trying to study things that fall out of that kind of bell curve, 68%, whatever, things that we see often. But people that, the process to make the DSM is decades long, and there are group panels for each of the 19 categories. And then it goes to the bigger board, and then it is now multidisciplinary. So it's not just psychiatry, it's psychology as well. And then it's also social work. So people that are making these decisions, you're having women that run these organizations. You're having big study groups, and then a bigger board. And then they, in the last DSM-5 that they created, which was the big jump from DSM-4, part of the ever long delayed process was, they would submit this for people to read it, and it was fairly transparent, and they would get feedback, and they would do all these things. And so, yeah, did that happen for DSM 1, 2, 3, 4? No, didn't. We're here now. And so I think these institutions have history, these fields have history, but I don't think it invalidates the past 25, 30 years of progress on all of the fronts that you've listed. So sure, I mean, I won't disagree with you on, what were we doing in 1952 with the first DSM? Yeah, it was, pretty terrible. But what have we been doing since 2000? What have we been doing since 2005, 2010? I think you can squabble about, some of the politics. Yeah. I mean, that's literally every single field has politics. And so I guess my focus is for folks to be aware of the history of things, but to not, I guess, miss, it's not like it's been 2 years or something. We're talking decades now of influence and how that changes. And I think you see that. In moving from an axle system to a multidimensional system, from moving from that system to a way that's a continuum. How do we look at those things? So I think that those are important. I want to. Yeah,
I totally. Yeah, I mean, and in the book, that's just like sort of the opening chapter. It's sort of a quick snapshot of the history, and then moving through the book, most of the book focuses on the people who are doing a great job and who are doing it well, and who are, sort of, it's a modern look at, what are people's experiences out in the world who feel kind of different or who feel sensitive, and how have they navigated their lives? How have they navigated work? And then, there's a whole chapter dedicated to, well-being, and many of the really outstanding therapists and psychologists who do know how to really support people who feel like they might be, a bit more sensitive in the world. So yeah, so I don't disagree or discount that at all. I think there's a lot of really amazing programs out there too that are very sort of expansive in thinking about the mind and that kind of thing. So those people are definitely all highlighted in the book. So yeah, I think it's a balance of kind of knowing where we come from, but then of course acknowledging how far we've gone too. So
yeah, no, I agree. The second point that you listed as well earlier was about this kind of normalcy thing. And so kind of in the middle of the book, you describe autism and ADHD and sensory processing and synesthesia. So just as a general, I guess, statements about those things, then we can get into some of the specifics. You mentioned this kind of normalcy thing. And I'll say this, disorders have they have a weird kind of place where they sit now. In some ways, it's a heuristic. It's a means to an end. So instead of having to list out these particular behaviors that are seen as showing significant impairment for the individual, we put it all together and we say it's this. But even if somebody has ADHD, I could put 10 people in this room right now that have a diagnosis of ADHD, and I'm going to have 10 different presentations of what that is, because you have 10 different people. You have 10 different individuals. And does that mean that they have, they don't have ADHD? No. But it means that you have to look at the individual. You always have to look at the individual. Anyone that's well trained, that's what's just kind of drilled into your head. It's not a label on a piece of paper. It's a person, right? This is a person that has significant hardships, significant challenges. How do you address that individual? And doing that by knowing what the label may be, that can inform you in some ways, but it's not necessarily defining of who the person is. And so I guess, so that's one thing. The second thing is, there is this is something I've talked about with a few people. So there's a challenge that we have that both APAs haven't figured out, I guess, which is, and this has to do with treatment, this has to do with funding, etc. People can have, I'll take anxiety because that's a kind of easy one. People may not have full criteria for, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder, but they do have anxiety symptoms, and they can be difficult, right? We have this, and this is true for many people. This is true of many mental health challenges, which is people don't meet the criteria. The reason there's a criteria is because it's empirically supported and defended by scientific research. It wasn't just a bunch of, old white dudes twirling their mustaches, just putting some arbitrary, labels or anything like that. This is informed by scientific literature, right? This is informed by thousands of randomized control blind studies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that are doing this. So I would say that if someone is refuting the idea of diagnostic labels, you're in some ways by proxy refuting the scientific method and the veracity of how they're able to do that for these things, especially when it's just been highly reproduced and replicated. But people are not going to always fit that criteria. And so the problem becomes, okay, you don't have the label, you don't have the disorder, and that's a good thing, right? That's good. We don't want that. I really detest people that are over, diagnosed and over pathologized and things like that. It's terrible. But it doesn't mean that people aren't hurting or suffering with symptoms of anxiety or symptoms of depression. And symptoms are a real thing. And because it's non-pathological, as we would say it, doesn't mean that they should not be afforded help or treatment in some ways. And I will 110% agree that this is a gray area and this is a problem that many mental health clinicians are trying to figure out. How do we help people in the gray, if you will? People that can't get a diagnosis, they can't get insurance to cover treatment, whatever that may look like. And that's a challenge. I think what does happen is people do get overdiagnosed just so they can get the treatment, which is not good. And sometimes people are underdiagnosed. And so there's that second piece too. So you can jump on any of those 2 points that you feel comfortable jumping on, and tell me what your thoughts are on that. And then I can just ask you about some of the specific disorders that you cover.
Yeah, I think, what you're pointing to, I share that concern, and I think this term, quote, subclinical, unquote, it's a really vital term, for people to know. And probably most people are sort of in that gray area that you're talking about at some point in their lives, right? Or have some kind of, subclinical presentation where it's not full blown enough to be a so-called disorder, but there's still stuff going on, And so for me, that's why I do feel sort of flexible or ambivalent, I guess, about people getting a diagnosis or not, because at the end of the day, what matters is what you're actually experiencing, right? And what your needs are. And it's so subjective as well. You could walk into one psychologist's office and receive a diagnosis, or you could walk into a different psychologist's office and not receive a diagnosis, right? Or the same thing with psychiatry. And so I do think there's a very sort of subjective component there. And yeah, I don't have the answers. I'm not a therapist. I'm a journalist, so my goal was just to sort of document what people's experiences were and what they were going through, and to sort of think through the words and framing around these things quite a bit, and just help people and get people to think a bit. And so, yeah.
I don't have all the answers either, and there's much smarter people than myself that are working hard to figure this out. But we do agree on this, and I do share that perspective of seeing that as a challenge. I'll just say, so there is subjectivity in it, but it is subjective, yes. But I could go to 4 different medical doctors and ask them about something and get 4 different answers too, right? It's not as black and white, I guess, with certain physical ailments. Sometimes it is, but yeah, I've had people professionally and personally that will tell me they'll go to 4 or 5 different medical doctors, and they'll tell them 3 different answers, right? That's just true of any field, I think. There are things that are not subjective. There, especially diagnostic criteria, it's not subjective in some ways. So let me give an example of this. So in the book, so I don't know again if this, I want to make sure I hear you right, but I think in the book, this is I forget where, it's probably in the 3rd or 4th chapter, but you say that autism is a living, breathing group of attributes that gets missed as a diagnosis because it's broad, overlaps with many other traits, and is steeped in media-driven stereotypes. While I would say that some of the presentation of that is possibly true, I think what is unequivocally certain is autism is just like ADHD, those are neurodevelopmental disorders. and that the ones in development, there is certain areas of the brain that has areas that did not grow as other folks that we would call neurotypical. There is less white and gray matter. There is less brain matter in the prefrontal cortex, less brain matter in the basal ganglia, and a few other regions. So it falls under that cluster of neurodevelopmental. I think that's important because we don't want people to be using autism or using certain symptoms as a way to say that they're part of that. If people that have autism have challenges with in utero, in development, and even afterward, after birth, that is purely neurodevelopmental. I mean, that's and the strict diagnostic criteria for that, has to be in the developmental period, early developmental period. So folks, and this is I think a misnomer that I think people get confused with, is that many people will have symptoms of something, but it does not mean that they have somewhere on a continuum or spectrum of these things. And people use this colloquially, which I don't think is very helpful, but they'll say like, oh, I'm somewhere on the spectrum. And when people say that, that's not true, I don't think, because of how it's defined. It's the same, I think, with ADHD. So I'll give you an example with ADHD. People will say that because, they can't focus, or they have inattention, or, things of this nature, they can't have sustained attention in certain places. Well, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that has a very strict criteria, right? It has to be, after age 6, we have for development, before age 12, has to be in 2 settings. And there has to be ways to show how there is some deficits in brain development. Furthermore, symptoms of inattention are in hypomania, they're in depression, they're in anxiety, they're in obsessive compulsive, they're in certain stress disorders. That's a symptom that could be seen in 4 or 5 or 6 other disorders. That's not by itself necessarily endemic to ADHD. And so I think with disorders, there are things that we know are true. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is replicated not only by scientific data that's been done for 50, 60 years now, but also from, brain scans and brain imaging, and from all of the different neuroscience journals that we have that show that these are neurodevelopmental disorders. And so I think it's important for folks to know that, and to know, hey, I may have challenges with attention. I may have challenges with socialization, social communication. I might have challenges with repetition. I might have challenges with many of these things. That doesn't make somebody, though, an individual that has autism or an individual that has ADHD. Those symptoms can be difficult, and they can be disarming and hard for them to interact with others or in certain contexts. But it does not mean that someone is somewhere in a range of a spectrum of sorts. The spectrum idea was for folks that have the very same baseline criteria, and then trying to figure out what their level was, level 1, 2, or 3. But I think anything outside of that starts to become on thin ice, I would say. So I don't know, you may have a disagreement with me on this, but this isn't my necessary opinion. This is, the scientific data and many of the association groups that have, and many of the neuroscientists that have shown how many of these neurodevelopmental disorders shake out.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you describe it all, because I think, you are a professional in this field, right? And so you've been trained a certain way, and this is your perspective coming from that field. So then I think what you have to think about is like, well, what is it like for the other side of that relationship? What is it like for people out there, your so-called users, right? Or your consumers, all of these people out there. And again, in my book, I focus on adult women. So people who have no expertise or specialty in this, they're not trained, they might work in tech. They might be a professor of philosophy, they might be, I interviewed so many different types of people, MIT professors and designers and artists. And, so all they want, is help or answers, right? And so they come to someone who is an expert, and in their minds, in the user's mind, they're thinking, oh, okay, this must be like super clear cut, right? And so I think it's like, it's almost too much to ask or something of a user who's going to come to the expert who is in clear need of help. And I think it's confusing for them because there's pros and cons either way, right? For this professor to come in and say they're struggling with X, Y, and Z. Sure, they just need some help. Maybe they just need, some straight up like therapy or something, right? But it's also very possible that the therapist, doesn't know actually that much about possible symptoms or presentations of something like autism and ADHD. They don't know enough, so they might not even bring it up. That might not be a lens for them in which to interact with this client. Or it's just, that's the part that I get kind of stuck on. And it goes back to what you were saying about the gray area, because what is it? What is the thing that is actually going to help this person, right? Even if someone doesn't have a full-blown disorder or full-blown diagnosis, and, as a side note, I do wish that everyone could get a brain scan. I think that would be enormously helpful, but our health care and medical system, our infrastructure is not set up to do that. So all we have to go off are these sort of experiences and talking it through and looking at some checklists and that kind of thing. I think for some people, having some kind of label or diagnosis or framework to even think about what they're going through, that's the helpful part. And again, I don't care if people get like a formal diagnosis or not, but my focus in the book, and I think even philosophically, is like, I think it's just important for people to be empowered with information and equipped with information. So if someone is walking around with enormous amounts of self-consciousness and shame or anxiety, and some of that sort of might fit into some autism spectrum stuff, that's fine. Just like learn about the autism spectrum, and it could shed a little bit of light on some component or some aspect of who they are. Does it mean they need to get some kind of diagnosis or look further? I don't know. I think that's very case by case. And that's a pretty typical example of someone who actually does end up going and trying to seek out answers, right? For something that's really persistent, that's not improving with any kind of talk therapy. It's not improving with the medication. So that question comes up of like, okay, what is this? Do I need to think about something else? And so again, I think there's just a real difference here between the professional, like the expert, what they're going through and sort of what's useful for them to think about, and then the person on the other side of that relationship. And so, and that was what I really explored in the book. It was kind of just this kind of investigative journey of talking to all these different women and their experiences, what they've been through in their lives, what the therapists were thinking, as they encountered them. And in terms of where it ends up, it almost didn't matter, right? Do they end up with some kind of formal diagnosis or not? And then, going beyond all of this, which is sort of like, a debate, I would say, within the field. At the end of the day, these women are out there living their lives and, very impactful people out in the workforce. And, the goal is for them to sort of integrate, right? I'm really big on this idea of integration. It's like, okay, maybe they do have some kind of wake up or realization that, some of the way their mind works might fit into X, Y, Z, but how do they integrate that into, their family life, their life with their spouse, their life at work and that kind of thing. So, I mean, the book does have a very sort of hopeful outlook for people who do feel kind of different in some way or sensitive in some way. And, finding and discovering that there are a lot of people out there who feel similarly.
Yeah. Well, I want to come to the last third of your book. I would say that I agree with, we share an agreement on, trying to respect the individual and try to get them help and to try and make sure that they're doing things in ways that can be beneficial for them, for their own authenticity, for their own quality of life. Again, I just say that, for people that have autism or ADHD, they don't choose to have that. It's not something they, it is something that is a lack of development in their brain. And it is so difficult. And I think if people are so casually identifying with a neurodevelopmental disorder, that's problematic, because we're going to have an influx of people that are wanting this, they're wanting help, they're wanting treatment, but they don't have a disorder, right?
But then what are their options? I think that's the question. Yeah. What are their options?
So that was my next point. I think what you may be describing is two things which are kind of connected. It is certainly true that people will have many different life events that will impact them, whatever it may be. It could be a death, it could be a birth, it could be a move, it could be the chronicity of certain things in the workforce, you name it, right? There's certain things in our environment that are impacting us all the time. And maybe they have a style or a temperament or aspects of personality that are different than how quote unquote normal people. I mean, I don't use that word, but whatever, right? We're not, the majority of folks, they're going through, right? They go to work, they hang out, they do things, and no one really pays attention. Everyone has their own issues in their own way, but yeah, maybe there are many, many folks that are socially awkward, or maybe they have a difficult time in certain groups, or maybe they have a difficult time relating. That's all true, but that could be mapped onto something in terms of temperamental style. That could be mapped onto certain things in their environment. That could be mapped onto certain traits of personality.
If those things are leading then to actual experiences of what could be categorized as mental illness, like if that disconnect that you're describing, mm-hmm. if that leads to something like severe depression, mm-hmm. there's a problem there that needs to be addressed. So I think, again, and you're kind of addressing different things, and I do think this is an issue actually in your field. And again, I'm a journalist, so I'm not setting out to solve this, but I do think that the very wide spectrum is kind of an issue, because I don't disagree with you about, sort of at the higher needs level of these spectrums. That to me is a very clear and distinct, and there are, services designed around that. And again, my audience for my book was, just kind of other adult women like me who are kind of just navigating the world. And there's these issues and questions coming up around work and family, mm-hmm. and that kind of thing. So I'm very clear about that in the book, mm-hmm, that, this mm-hmm. is sort of written to address sort of that demographic. The sort of there's many different demographics, and there are lots of other books, to address those different demographics. So I'm not really addressing that. But I think what it seems like we keep coming back to in this conversation is what are the answers? What are the options for the people who kind of don't fit, or they're in the gray or something like that? And so I think, and I think you probably, I don't know which populations you see in your work, but
I see adults, and I see adults with a wide range of challenges. And I am again, not because of my own opinions. Again, this is, I'm very much a person of science. I'm very much a person of obviously I have lots of experience now at this point, 15 plus years. I have done away with trying to diagnose people. I don't even really care about diagnosis, right? When I teach diagnosis, I don't care. I tell the students, I'm like, you got to learn this, and then you kind of have to like forget it afterwards. Like, it's just kind of a thing you have to do. Like, it's very important, right? So I talk out of both sides of my mouth on this. It's very important to diagnose, because when you see something, it's important to get it right. It's important to get it right, because if you get it wrong, it can be very harmful inadvertently. And at the same time, in terms of your treatment, right? So one's diagnosis, one's treatment. When you're doing treatment, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. It doesn't matter. Like, if this person has challenges socially, personally, cognitively, whatever, that's what's important. When I see a client week in and week out, I'm not thinking, oh, here's my client that has this disorder. I don't think about that. It doesn't really matter to me. It doesn't inform my treatment in that way. It can sometimes. The popular example I use of this all the time is if somebody is, let's say, has some type of, let's say they have bipolar, and bipolar 1, and they meet criteria, but they present as having depression, because this is typically what happens. You see a depressive episode, you don't see the mania for a while, and that person is given antidepressants. Giving someone with antidepressants that has bipolar when they need either mood stabilizer or anticonvulsants could make them more depressed and or suicidal. It's harmful. That's important to diagnose correctly. That is very important, because you're talking about someone that has a wrong diagnosis or misdiagnosis, and they could be inadvertently harmed. And it's tricky. And you have to know your diagnoses. You have to know. That's why you go to school. That's why you're trained. That's why we have license, that boards and all these things to help keep us ethical and keep us with best practices. Again, I don't work with children that much, but I have previously. But because someone is quirky or eccentric or maybe offbeat or something, I'm not running to autism, right? That is a last resort. I don't want them to have that as much as possible. And if they do, they do. They could have level 1, which is a quote unquote high functioning autism, which I don't like that term, but they're able to navigate a little bit better in society than folks with level 2, kind of moderate, or level 3, which is very severe. But again, that has to be reserved if you meet criteria. There's very strict criteria over certain time frames, significant impairment in multiple areas of functioning. But that doesn't say about treatment necessarily, right? Of course, a diagnosis can give people certain treatments, and there's certain federal dollars that are in the pot there for that. But to your point, and I'm agreeing with you, there are plenty of people that do not fit that criteria, but they have challenges, right? People in tech, maybe women that are as they age or they get older, or different developmental periods for themselves, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of groups that they have a different style, they have a different temperament, they're different ways socially, and they have challenges. They have relationship challenges, they have maybe some problems with certain interactions at work or things like that. And I mean problems or challenges, meaning that interacting with other people that probably don't have that as a majority. Yeah, and they 100% need help. But they don't need to be associated with a neurodevelopmental disorder to get that help. That's not requirement to get that help. Does it leave a gray area diagnostically? Sure. Does it leave a gray area therapeutically? No, not if you're good. Not if you're a good clinician, not if you're a good therapist. Because for treatment, the disorder is less relevant. For, if you're trying to get certain medication, if you're trying to get certain services and you need a diagnosis, okay, it's very important. And so I think that, again, I'm not a a zealous person on diagnosing in that way, and when it comes to treatment. But I do think it, in the space that it's important, and there is a space that it's important to get that right. And listen, I mean, you're saying what I've been saying too. I part of the reason why I teach is to help students and trainees and future clinicians to get it right. So that way they each client, potential client, deserves the right, as someone that has, they're seeing an expert, is to know inside and out what a disorder is and is not. And they deserve the right to explain that to a client in an intelligible way, in the way that they can understand things. That is the role and the job of the clinician. That's not the role of Google and WebMD and whatever else. That's the job of the clinician. And unfortunately, there's a lot of shit clinicians out there that don't fucking know how to do that. And that's a disservice to the field, and that's shame on them. But there are many wonderful people out there that don't do this. And so I also am concerned about folks that are in the gray and people that have symptoms, but they don't meet criteria. Fine. Okay, I don't care. How do we help folks that are having challenges? And what does that look like? And to that end, I think it's important to say, okay, you don't have this, but you are hurting, you are suffering, you are having some difficulties. And what can we do to try and use that? Does that mean that maybe some techniques that have been used with folks in certain types of categories, say autism or things like that, could be used? Maybe. I'm not saying that you couldn't use that, but I think in terms of labeling and diagnosis, I think it's important to say that, because my fear is that, and this is no one's fault, but the terms is kind of like the term with trauma has gotten very watered down and very misapplied and overapplied. And it's very hard to really have that conversation of what's real trauma and what's not, or what's clinical trauma and what isn't. And that's you don't want things to become watered down, or people that are becoming over-diagnosed with something or over-identifying with something because it doesn't fit and they don't fit in that category, but I'll align myself because it's close enough. I think there's a danger with that downstream. And, I want people to have accurate information, but then also to have quality treatment as well, regardless of what your disorder is or is not. And that becomes irrelevant with treatment. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about any of that. I
do. I mean, I think we're really now getting to the heart of this, and we're hitting the nail on the head, because I think this is exactly the issue. There are so many people out there. And again, my focus is adult women, but there are so many women who really haven't been helped. They haven't been served, and they have seen multiple therapists, maybe even psychiatrists, or, something I focus on in the book is actually occupational therapists, which can be very helpful for some of these things. And so they're exhausted. They're in the position where they've been walking around looking for help for a really long time. Nothing has really felt like a fit. Right. And so they get to the point where they're just like, well, like, what is this? What is going on? Right. And so that's often when something like, some kind of diagnosis or framework can be helpful. Again, whether it's just information for them to be aware of, or, if a formal diagnosis is merited. but I just think, maybe it's possible that a whole new category gets created. And I think actually you already do have something, right? Isn't it called NOS, not otherwise specified?
Yeah, we've changed that. Okay. Yeah, it was kind of a throwaway term. Now we have two diversions from that. We have other specified and I'm drawing a blank on the other one.
But yeah, I just think this is the issue. I mean, this is really the issue. And I think I do think these subtleties and nuances, I think, we use this term a lot, but these are important. And these are the things that get left out in terms of not only, like media coverage and that kind of thing, but even I would say in a therapeutic setting, even, because this is a lot to ask actually of like a single therapist or a single psychologist. Sure, I mean, this is a pretty wide ranging sociological / academic kind of conversation that you and I are having right now, as two people who reflect a lot on these things. But, there's plenty of MFTs out there, they're marriage and family therapists, they've got a few years of training. They're kind of a general practitioner. They're not highly specialized, but maybe that's what's available in the local clinic and in some town. And so, if someone might see them for a year or two, and maybe it's a little helpful, but, it's not thorough or complete, and so I do think that that's probably a pretty significant chunk of the population is in that situation, right? And it's great that they can get some level of help. But, there's information missing. And so I don't know what the answer is. Again, I think it's just important for people to have information. And, I kind of like what you're saying about, maybe even if someone doesn't fit, into some full-blown category or label, it's possible that some aspect of like a therapeutic treatment for that thing could still be helpful for that person, even if they don't fit into it fully. And so I think that actually is probably an area that should be explored further. Again, I, have most of the chapter I did on SPD, sensory processing disorder, is about occupational therapy, which is this really interesting specialty that, is often used with kids, but adults can benefit too, where it's, it really focuses on the body and sort of like postural awareness and these, there's subtle things that can help your, just sort of, sense of agency, because it has to do with, your body and your alignment and getting enough like input and, all of these things, because we sit so much, actually do affect our, sort of mental health and our attention issues and things like that. So yeah, sometimes it's just something subtle that's needed. But I think for people who walk around for so long not getting what they need, then in a way their needs intensify. And so then it could look like they possibly do have some kind of disorder or diagnosis, or they themselves will feel like they do fit into that, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree with almost everything you said there. I think that's that is really difficult. Just as a clarifying point, that the NOS was replaced by other specified and unspecified. The problem is this is a bigger issue, right? Which I can't fix, you can't fix, and a lot of people can't fix. But it's managed care. If you're using insurance, they're only going to pay if you have a certain diagnosis. They're not going to pay for another specified or unspecified. It doesn't, and that's problematic for many reasons. There's many problems with that. I do think what you were saying about like LMFTs and things like that. Yeah, there's some great LMFTs. I think what the push has been in the past 10 plus years is really trying at the accreditation side and on the licensing side to really push people to be clinical. And one of the clinical things is some version of the conversation we're having, right? That's what signifies. Someone knows what it is and what it is not, right? And trying to be held accountable for that. But look, I mean, part of the reason why psychiatrists are upset with psychologists is because there's not enough psychiatrists to go to New Mexico and Oklahoma. And so they're giving adjunctive training for psychologists to prescribe medication. And they're very upset about it, as they should be. And vice versa. And this happens all the way down the line. You have certain people that are, doing some types of therapeutic interventions, and they did an adjunctive because there's not enough people in certain parts of the country, which is also problematic. So yes, I think the more that we understand about personality and temperament, and cognition and the brain and human behavior, again, psychology as a science has really only been 120 years old. So there's still so much to do. There's so much to work towards. I think that's what people are trying to do. I think of somebody I had on the podcast last year was Lucy Folks, who's a research psychologist out in England, and she wrote a fantastic book, which everyone should get. I think the English, it just came out here in the US, the title is Losing Our Minds. I think that's right. I could have that wrong. Maybe that's the British. I don't know. The English and the British and US versions changed titles a little slightly, but Losing Our Minds is the title. And she writes about this, and we talked about this same thing. This is something that is the case of, look, there are people that have symptoms but don't have a disorder, and they still need help. The end. Full stop. Like, that has to be dealt with. And how does one do that? Because I think in the 90s, there was just, everyone was diagnosed with ADHD. All these kids were diagnosed with ADHD, and probably half of them don't have it, which is good. That's a good thing. That doesn't mean that they didn't have behavioral challenges or attention challenges or et cetera. So it becomes very difficult. You kind of have this kind of bottleneck kind of thing that happens, and it's like, okay, but these people aren't getting treatment. And how does that happen? And so I don't want there to be, I always kind of joke that, my goodness, every DSM edition, it's 300 pages bigger, right? And when the first one was like 120 pages, it was like a pamphlet almost. The DSM-5 TR comes out in a couple of weeks, and it's 1,100 pages. It's just, the DSM-5 was 800 pages, right? It's going to be 2,000 pages at a certain point. Does that mean that there's more disorders? No, of course not. Of course there isn't. I think just different ways of trying to have a more accuracy and trying to specifically say something what it is and what it isn't is part of the project there. Political bullshit aside. But it's like, okay, but how do we move away? And I think in some ways, even though it's getting bigger, I think in some ways, many people have moved away from diagnosing, because we don't want more percentage of the population to be quote unquote disordered, right? We don't want everyone walking around here with a disorder and a diagnosis. We don't want that. That's the opposite of what we want. But I know that many people will, kind of stretch it and say, well, you need treatment. Good enough. I can make it work, and give someone the diagnosis so they get treatment. I know that happens. And that's difficult, because you want someone to get treatment. You want them to, not everyone has $250 to, pay for therapy every week, if that's what they need. So if their insurance is going to cover it because they have, the ICD, 11 code or whatever for whatever diagnosis, okay, then it's, $30 copay as opposed to $250. That's a big deal. So I would say that it is a frustrating question. I don't have the answer to. You don't have the answer to. I try my best to work hard on it. I know you try your best to work hard on it. The last question I'll ask you here is about it kind of what we've talked about a little bit is in the last third of your book is, what is the I don't want to say responsibility, but that's the only thing that's coming to my mind. But how can each person try their best to take care of themselves? But then also, what is the role that certain work environments or certain things in society can also be helpful for people that may have, not the normative way of doing things? How do both people do it? How do people work on themselves and not just expect everyone to change everything? But then also, how do certain settings and environments within the world also make some concessions to say, hey, we can be a little bit more robust in how we're considered of different types of folks? How do you see that kind of balancing act of sorts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am a big fan of people, getting equipped with information. I think reading is very helpful, and just getting a better sense of, who you are, how you operate in the world, especially as you get older, doing what you can for yourself in terms of what's available. I know personally, I have found like physical outlets to be very helpful, just for like day-to-day managing stress and things like that. I always did gymnastics, and now I'm a big swimmer and I jog every day. So, that's kind of a usual recommendation, right? Like making sure you get enough like sort of physical activity. Yeah. Obviously, I think diet and nutrition is hugely important. And I'm always looking forward to more research in that area. In terms of how, larger sort of settings in our lives, like work or family or school and that kind of thing, can make room for people who might be a little different or particularly sensitive. Even there, we've started to see some progress. There's a lot more awareness these days around like sensory differences and sensory needs. I think the sort of norm in our culture has been, no one would even really think twice around like super loud noises and things like that. But I think there's a little bit more awareness of that now, which I think is very helpful. Even in workspaces, there was that huge rise in like open office workspaces. It's kind of short-lived, but there was a lot of pushback against that. And that's, Susan Cain, who wrote Quiet, who, also I interviewed in my book, and she really supported my book. She's written a lot around how that's really not a healthy option for people who are sensitive or more introverted. And so, yeah, I would say that we are seeing greater awareness, which is awesome, in terms of thinking around, about, our diverse needs. So I explore all of that in the book, and it's been so great to chat about all this with you.
Yeah, no, it's a really awesome conversation. I really have enjoyed it. The book is called Divergent Mind: Thriving in a World That Wasn't Designed for You. You can it's in paperback, and I guess the hardcover is still out there. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you and all of your work?
Yeah, well, the book is everywhere, all the major booksellers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, indie bookstores. And I'm primarily on Instagram, actually, and Twitter as well. And my website is divergentlit.com. And
Yeah, that's wonderful. This was such a fun conversation. I was looking forward to it, and it did not disappoint. I really enjoyed talking with you and hearing your passion, and then, being able to try and hopefully illuminate for people the challenges that are there, right? There is this gray area, and it's like, I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers, and that's okay. but trying to talk more about some of those challenges, I think, is super important. So I'm super grateful that you were able to do that with me. It's really important.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great.
Of course. All right. Thank you.